Hi everyone, today we'll look at nutrient cycles from AQA topic 5. So within this section, we'll start off with looking at the role of saprobionts and mycorrhizae. We'll then move on to the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and we'll end with the use of fertilisers and the environmental issues that are associated with them. All nutrients are recycled within natural ecosystems, and saprobionts play a vital role within this process. So first of all, what exactly are saprobionts? Well, they're one type of decomposer that rely on extracellular digestion for their nutrition. So this means they secrete hydrolytic enzymes which break down their food outside of the cells, then the useful products can be absorbed and assimilated. We'll see the role of saprobionts in both the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, where they feed off the remains of dead plants and animals and also on their waste. But first of all, we need to consider what type of molecules might we find nitrogen and phosphorus within these remains. Well, for nitrogen, we find them within the amino group of proteins. We find them in the nitrogen-containing bases of our nucleic acids and also in ATP. And the coenzymes NADP and NAD also contain nitrogen. For phosphorus, we've got phosphate groups within nucleic acids and within ATP. We also find phosphate groups within phospholipids in all the cell membranes. And again, phosphorus is also found within NADP and NAD. Some types of fungi and many bacteria have this form of saprobiotic nutrition. In both the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, we'll see how nutrients are absorbed from the soil by plants. Mycorrhizae assist with this process. So mycorrhizae are an association between the root system of the plants and certain types of fungi. This serves as a mutualistic relationship where there's benefit to both organisms. This is also called symbiosis. So in terms of the plant benefiting, the association with the fungus allows for an increased surface area for water and ions to be absorbed across. In turn, the fungi can receive organic compounds from the plant that have been produced during photosynthesis. So now on to the nitrogen cycle. There's 4 reactions that you need to be aware of as part of the nitrogen cycle, and the first one being ammonification. So if we start with the nitrogen containing compounds within the dead organisms and their waste, so we looked before at nitrogen being contained within proteins, nucleic acids, ATP and coenzymes. These are converted into ammonium ions by the saprobionts as part of the process of decomposition. The next stage is nitrification. So those ammonium ions need to be converted into nitrates that can be absorbed from the soil by the plant root system. This is a 2-step process. So first of all, they become nitrites. This process is carried out by nitrifying bacteria. The nitrites are then further converted on to produce the nitrates, and this allows the nitrogen to be within a form that can be absorbed by plants from the soil. You don't need to know the names of any specific species of nitrifying bacteria, but you do need to appreciate that this is a 2-step process. We then can add to our cycle another reaction called nitrogen fixation. This is where the nitrogen gas within the atmosphere is fixed into nitrogen-containing compounds that can be used by the plants. This is carried out by nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria live in the leguminous root nodules of plants such as beans, peas and clover, and again a reminder that you don't need to know the names of specific species. There are other free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria within the soil. Those that live within the root nodules form a mutualistic relationship with the plant. So this allows the plant to be provided with the nitrogen compounds, so nitrates, for example. The plant provides the carbohydrates generated in photosynthesis for the bacteria's respiration. The final reaction within the nitrogen cycle that you need to know is denitrification. This is where the nitrogen within the nitrates is released as nitrogen gas to the atmosphere, and it's carried out by denitrifying bacteria. These bacteria respire anaerobically, so look out for conditions such as waterlogged soil where there's a lack of oxygen. Denitrifying bacteria respire nitrates and produce N2 gas as a waste product of their respiration. So now we can put these four processes all together to build the entire nitrogen cycle. So if we start with the nitrogen-containing compounds within plants, which are passed on to animal consumers, and these nitrogen-containing compounds within the dead plants and animals or within their waste are converted to ammonium compounds as part of decomposition, and that is by our saprobionts. So this process is ammonification. The ammonium ions are then first converted to nitrites and then onto nitrates by nitrifying bacteria in the process of nitrification. We now have the nitrates which can be absorbed by the plant roots, and we've completed our first cycle. We can then extend this and add on a second loop, an outer loop to the cycle. So we've got denitrification, where the nitrogen is released from the nitrates by the denitrifying bacteria into nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. The nitrogen gas can then be fixed by nitrogen fixing bacteria. So these are the bacteria that form a mutualistic relationship with leguminous plant roots, and they will convert the nitrogen gas back into nitrogen containing compounds. So the second nutrient cycle that you need to know is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is contained within rocks as phosphate ions, which through the process of weathering can be deposited within the soil and then taken up by plant root systems and incorporated into phosphorus containing molecules. These are then going to be passed on to animal consumers. So we now have phosphate ions within the phospholipids of cell membranes, nucleic acids, and ATP. Some of those phosphate ions will also be passed out within the feces and the urine of the animals. And then we have the role of our decomposers in returning those phosphate ions back to the soil. So now we can see we've got our first cycle. The phosphate ions within the rocks could also be deposited into the oceans and lakes and passed up aquatic food chains, eventually being passed on to seabirds. Seabirds then return to land and would deposit guano. So guano is seabird excrement that contains a high proportion of phosphate ions. This can then be decomposed, returning the phosphate to the soil. We also have bones and shells which may be sedimented and brought back to land as rock. Now we come on to the use of fertilisers within farming. So why is this necessary? Well, farming practices result in plants and animals being transported away. So these natural nutrient cycles are interrupted and the nutrients are not returned to the soil. So to avoid the soil becoming nutrient poor, we need to replace those nutrients by using fertilisers. So the first type is organic fertilisers. So this would be things like manure or compost that can be naturally broken down by those saprobionts to return those nutrients to the soil. However, we're never quite sure if the right balance of nutrients is going to be returned. So we can have inorganic fertilisers that are commercially made to balance the correct proportions of each nutrient. However, these tend to be more soluble and this can lead to environmental problems within itself. We now come on to some of the environmental issues that are associated with using fertilisers. So firstly, an example of why it is so important to get the balance of nutrients right within the soil. If this doesn't happen, we may interfere with the species diversity. So for example, nitrogen-rich soils may favour certain species such as grasses and nettles. And so if those conditions are more favourable for those species, we may lose other species and reduce the diversity. The second problem is the main one that you will need to talk about. So this is leaching and eutrophication. So those fertilisers that have been added to the farmers' fields, some of the nutrients within that will dissolve within the rainwater and run off into waterways. So this is what we mean by leaching, and it can lead to eutrophication. So we have, first of all, the leaching of the fertilisers from the fields, running off into waterways. This increased concentration of nutrients causes the small microscopic algae to reproduce really quickly and produce a green covering over the surface of the water, which is known as an algal bloom. The problem is that this is going to block the light for any photosynthesizing aquatic plants below. So without photosynthesis, those plants will not have any respiratory substrate and therefore will die. Their remains would then be decomposed. And so we've got an increase in the aerobic respiration by the decomposers, which will deplete the water of oxygen and lead on to the death of fish and other aquatic organisms, as there is no oxygen for their aerobic respiration.